Today, I'm going to tell you about a man who found himself trapped in a world of dictatorship and injustice. He was forced to turn his back even on his own wife just to break free and leave all that suffocating filth behind. The main character of this story is a fireman named Tag. And at first, that might not sound unusual, but in this world, everything works the other way around. Firemen don't put out fires here, they start them. People have long forgotten about accidental house fires, thanks to homes built with advanced technology. Now, the main job of a fireman is to find and burn books. Yes, you heard that right. Owning books is considered a crime against the state, and anyone who reads them or simply hides them at home automatically becomes a criminal. Usually, the fire station receives an anonymous tip from a neighbor or even a family member. The tip points them to a house where books are being hidden, and the fire engine immediately races to the scene so the firemen can soak the books and furniture in kerosene and burn everything in their path. Every fireman wears an orange salamander on his uniform, a creature that, according to old legends, could live in fire. And on every helmet, you can see the number 451 because that's the temperature at which paper begins to burn. Honestly, no one even remembers a time when firemen actually put out fires anymore. People are completely different now. They've been taught that firemen have always burned books. The real history of the past disappeared somewhere along the way. A new truth was forced on people, and they accepted it without question. I think this story feels especially relevant right now, in the world we live in today. So, to sum it all up, books are destroyed, the elderly stay silent, and most people have absolutely no interest in the past. For most of his life, the main character had lived comfortably in this familiar world. He enjoyed watching fire consume things, watching them turn black and change before his eyes. Tag loved the smell of kerosene, the glow of the flames, and the feeling of having power over other people's lives. Books didn't interest him in the slightest, and he honestly believed he was doing something useful. To be honest, he had never even stopped to think about where this strange world was heading. All the other firemen worked the same way because that was the law, and those were the rules now. But at some point, Tag's feelings about his job slowly began to change. Deep inside, doubts began to appear where there had never been any before. He started to feel that something about this world was deeply wrong, as though everyone had been deceived and had willingly accepted the lie. Of course, he couldn't explain exactly what was wrong, and that uncertainty created a growing emptiness inside him. After work, Tag always returned home to his wife, Mildred. They'd been married for years, yet they barely spoke to each other. Mildred spent her entire day in a room where every wall had been turned into a giant television screen. She had spent almost all the family's spare money on them. Also, she could watch shows about fictional families and fictional problems. She even thought of the actors in those shows as her own relatives. That was how badly these people had been brainwashed. By the way, these so-called relatives on television constantly spoke directly to the viewers, asked them simple questions, and paused so the person watching could answer. That made people feel like they were actually taking part in what was happening and belonged to one big, happy family. At the same time, hardly anyone noticed that no real communication was happening at all. That was because the actors spoke loudly and quickly, barely giving the viewer any time to think. As a result, just an hour later, Mildred couldn't even explain what had happened in the episode or what the point of it was. Some of you might be thinking that things don't sound all that bad, but don't jump to conclusions. Between shows, Mildred constantly wore tiny radios in her ears, what we would simply call earbuds today. Even at night, she fell asleep listening to music and the voices of complete strangers. And it wasn't just her. Every normal person in this new world lived the same way. Their minds had almost wasted away under the constant flood of information, and they had simply forgotten how to think. An invisible wall had grown between Mildred and her husband because they never talked and barely knew each other at all. One night, Tag came home and found his wife unconscious. Her strange lifestyle had left her unable to sleep properly, so she took sleeping pills, and that night she had clearly taken far too many. He even had to call emergency services to make sure she didn't die. But as it turned out, the people who arrived weren't surprised by what had happened at all. Apparently, the same thing was happening in homes all over the city, and almost no one could sleep normally anymore. They'd even developed a standard procedure so doctors wouldn't have to respond to every call, and ordinary technicians could handle sleeping pill overdoses themselves. The next morning, Mildred remembered nothing and even refused to believe she had tried to take her own life. Naturally, her behavior terrified Mintag, who could tell she was deeply unhappy even though she refused to admit it. But the most frightening part was that he had no idea how to help her, and he didn't even know how to help himself. They lived under the same roof and slept in the same room, yet they remained complete strangers. The only thing that comforted them was knowing their family was no different from anyone else's. After all, everyone lived this way, so it had to be normal. Well, as you've probably already guessed, one day everything began to change, and that was what made this story truly special. On a cool autumn day, Mintag met a girl from his neighborhood named Clarice McClellan. She was only 17, thin and extremely pale, but there was a spark of life in her, as though happiness was constantly spilling out of her. The moment you saw her on the street, she stood out because she behaved completely differently from everyone else. Clarice was never in a hurry. She calmly looked at the trees around her and even listened to the wind as though she could hear its voice. Meanwhile, everyone else walked straight past without even lifting their heads. The strange girl immediately caught Mintag's attention. She wasn't afraid of him at all and made no attempt to leave. Instead, she started talking to him as though they had known each other for years. Within a few minutes, she openly admitted that she loved walking at night, looking at the moon, and breathing in the smell of autumn leaves. Strangely enough, she even noticed the dew on the grass, although many people in the city didn't even know what dew was. Mintag thought she might be unstable or even close to insane, but for some reason, his instincts told him not to leave and to keep talking to her. Of course, part of him knew that almost no one in the city walked anywhere anymore. People traveled at incredible speeds, so anyone walking near the road risked being run over. The world around them had even been redesigned to match those speeds. For example, billboards had been made incredibly long so that people speeding past in cars would still have enough time to read them. Clarice didn't seem to care about any of that. She kept telling Mintag about herself and her family, which surprised him even more. At first, he could barely believe that she and her family gathered together in the evenings just to talk and remember the past. Society now considered that kind of behavior suspicious because normal people were supposed to watch television and avoid asking unnecessary questions. The neighbors had reported the girl several times, and she had even been sent to a psychiatrist simply because she didn't want to be like everyone else. She had no interest in high-speed driving, violent games, or meaningless entertainment. She much preferred watching people and thinking about philosophical questions. When Mintag heard about a close family that actually talked to one another, he realized he wouldn't be able to give up his conversations with Clarice. From that point on, he no longer rushed straight home after every shift. Instead, he stayed out a little longer so he could walk and talk with her. She was only 17, and he had no romantic feelings for her. It was simply a chance to connect with another person and fill the emptiness that had been eating him alive from the inside. During one of their walks, Clarice asked him whether there had really once been a time when houses accidentally caught fire because people were careless. Had firemen really once been needed to put out fires instead of starting them? Mintag laughed and repeated the official explanation that firemen had always burned books. But despite his laughter, something shifted inside him, and the girl's words stayed in his mind. When he thought about it, Clarice was asking questions no one had ever asked him before. She wasn't trying to argue with him or accuse him of anything. She simply wanted to understand how the world worked. At the end of their walk, she suddenly asked Mintag whether he was happy. He laughed again and said that of course he was happy. He had a job, a loving wife, and everything a normal person was supposed to have. I think you've already guessed that once he headed home, he kept thinking about that question and no longer felt nearly as certain. When he returned home and once again saw his wife unconscious, he probably asked himself for the first time, was he actually happy? His mind immediately filled with questions. Why did his wife keep swallowing pills, and why did he come home to an empty house every night? There was another important question as well. Why did he enjoy talking to a girl he barely knew more than talking to his own wife? Over the next few days, Mintag met Clarice several more times. They continued walking and talking, and his life finally began to feel like it had some kind of meaning. Still, not everything was quite so simple. Clarice told him that people at school considered her antisocial, which sounded extremely strange because whenever she was with Mintag, she could barely stop talking. The truth was that she had a completely different idea of what a conversation was supposed to be. At school, children were constantly shown films, forced to memorize ready-made answers, and then sent off to play sports after class. No one cared about real questions, and conversations were nothing more than people repeating lines they had already been given. In other words, it all felt dry, unpleasant, and painfully fake. At the same time, the other students were incredibly cruel. To them, tormenting one another was completely normal. They already knew how to drive, and every day they deliberately ran people down in the street, as though death had become just another form of entertainment. All these conversations gradually changed the way Mintag saw the familiar city around him. He finally began to notice the smell of rain, the moonlight, and the silence while returning to his old life became harder and harder. Talking to ordinary people was especially difficult because after his real conversations with Clarice, everything else felt like a pathetic imitation of human connection. These were good changes in a man who had once been part of the system, but then everything fell apart. One day, Clarice didn't show up for their meeting, and after that, she disappeared completely. Mintag assumed she was simply sick, but even after a week, nothing had changed. His wife casually mentioned that no one had seen the McClellan family next door for some time. Apparently, Clarice had been hit by a car and the rest of her family had moved away. Mildred spoke about it with such indifference that it sounded like she was describing a scene from a Hollywood movie rather than the death of a real person. Mintag, on the other hand, was devastated the moment he learned what had happened to his friend. He still wasn't completely sure the story was true, but his heart tightened with pain and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. That was when he realized that this world had almost no place left for people like Clarice. And that wasn't the only bad news. The other firemen began to notice that Mintag was gradually changing. The person who noticed it most was the fire chief, Mr. Beatty, who always kept a close eye on everyone. It's worth saying right away that Beatty was a very dangerous man. He wasn't just calm and intelligent. He also understood exactly how the system of this new world worked. The fire station was also home to an 8-legged mechanical hound. It could memorize a person's scent, track them down, and inject them with lethal poison through a special needle. Sometimes, the firemen entertained themselves by letting the hound kill small animals. They even placed baits, making money from the deaths of completely innocent creatures. Mintag had stopped enjoying that kind of entertainment, and one day the mechanical hound even started growling at him. Mintag managed to step away, but the incident frightened him, so he immediately told the chief. Instead of reassuring him, Beatty merely smirked. In his opinion, machines didn't make mistakes, and if the hound reacted to someone, then it had a reason. From that moment on, Mintag no longer felt the same sense of calm or confidence about the future. He became obsessed with the thought that someone was always watching him, and the final straw came with another call. Just after the rain, on a cool autumn night, the fire crew arrived at an old house where they discovered an entire library. Usually, the homeowners were arrested beforehand so the firemen could burn an empty building without anyone getting in their way. But this time, the elderly woman who owned the house had decided to stay inside and had no intention of leaving. The The fireman ignored her, stormed into the house, and began throwing books down from the upper floors. As Mentag watched, he suddenly felt that the books were almost like living things and shouldn't be treated this way. He even found himself thinking about how much time people had spent writing each one. Every book represented years of thought, yet the fireman needed only a few minutes to destroy it all. During the search, one of the books fell into his hands. No one noticed, and almost without thinking, Mentag slipped it beneath his jacket. Perhaps this wasn't even the first book he had stolen. For some time, he may have been quietly taking books from fires and hiding them at home. I wouldn't even be surprised if he was afraid to admit it to himself, because once a person begins to change inside, everything can happen incredibly fast. It's like planting a tree and then watching it slowly begin to grow. Now, let's return to the story where the fireman tried to force the woman out of the house. She flatly refused to leave, and she certainly had no intention of going to prison for her so-called crimes. The most surprising part was that she didn't resist or even scream. She simply chose to remain among her books, holding a match in her hand. As soon as the firemen stepped outside, the woman beat them to it and set both the books and herself on fire. For Mentag, it was a genuine shock, something he would never forget. He couldn't understand how someone could willingly choose death rather than leave her books behind. That raised an obvious question: what could possibly be inside those books that made an elderly woman refuse to save herself? Only a madman would die for something completely worthless. For the rest of the night, Mentag felt as though he were moving through a fog. Then he returned home and hid the stolen book. He developed a fever, and the smell of kerosene began to make him sick. The next morning, Mentag refused to go to work and told his wife he was ill. At one point, he tried to tell Mildred about the woman who had died, hoping she would at least stop and think about what had happened, but it made no difference. The only thing Mildred cared about was the trouble her husband might get into for missing work. That was when he admitted for the first time that he was no longer sure he wanted to remain a fireman. From that moment on, he understood that the firemen were destroying something genuinely important, and that the people who wrote books had been trying to reveal some hidden truth to the world. Mentag wasn't given much time to rest because before long, his chief, Mr. Beatty, came to visit him. The cunning man clearly understood what was happening to Mentag. According to him, almost every fireman eventually began asking questions and even became curious about books. That was why the chief had personally come to Mentag's house, to explain how society had reached the point where literature was burned. None of it had happened overnight. Life had gradually become faster, and people no longer had time to read or think. Long works were shortened, and eventually books were replaced entirely by brief summaries. At the same time, society became increasingly afraid of offending anyone, while almost any book could upset a particular group or make someone feel stupid. From that point on, controversial ideas were gradually removed. I think it's hard to remain indifferent to what you're hearing because the events of this story sound far too much like the world we live in today. And yet the book was written many years ago, back in the previous century. Beatty explained that people were now given simple entertainment that required no thought, all to keep them from ever being left alone in silence. That was how people gradually gave up books on their own, while the government merely banned something almost no one wanted anymore. Firemen existed only to destroy the last remaining books and the people who were supposed to preserve them. The system seemed to want everyone to become as alike as to drops of water and for everyone to be happy. In this new world, there were no longer any giants standing beside ordinary people and making them feel small. Books were seen as loaded guns that could harm society. Put simply, Beatty believed books made people unhappy because one author said one thing while another claimed the exact opposite. That caused people to doubt, argue, and ask foolish questions, and society had no need for any of that. The most interesting part was that the fire chief himself constantly quoted books, and it was obvious that he knew literature far better than Mentag did. Perhaps he too had once tried to find answers and fill the emptiness inside him, only to become disappointed and eventually side with the system. Beatty allowed Montag to stay home for one more day, but the conversation didn't end there. The chief hinted that firemen sometimes accidentally took books from the scene of a crime, but they were given 24 hours to burn the forbidden material on their own. And if the book wasn't destroyed, the firemen would come and do it themselves. After Beatty left, Montag realized there was no longer any point in hiding. He walked over to the air vent and pulled out the books he had hidden inside. There were quite a few of them, and Montag couldn't even remember taking them from the burning houses. It was as though his heart had been guiding him toward the right choice, while his mind had spent all that time denying what was happening. When Mildred saw all the books, she screamed bloody murder. She ordered her husband to burn the horrible paper immediately, but Montag begged her to give him a little time. He simply wanted to understand what was inside the books and why the government was so afraid of them. Why were people willing to go to prison and even die for books? And why had one brief encounter with Clarice changed his life forever? Montag still had no idea what he was going to do next, but he understood perfectly well that returning to his old life was no longer possible. First, he decided to open the books and tried to understand what made them so interesting and why they stirred such powerful emotions in completely different people. He thought it would be easy, but he was disappointed almost immediately. Reading turned out to be much harder than he had expected because everything shown on television had gradually made society less intelligent. Montag was used to a world where everything was delivered quickly, loudly, and simply. Nothing required any complex thought, and even advertisements repeated the same phrase over and over until it got stuck in your head. A book worked in a completely different way and was in no hurry to explain its meaning to the reader. To understand what the author was trying to say, a person had to stop, read the words carefully, connect them, and truly think. While Montag tried to understand the deeper meaning of the books, his wife looked at him like he was a fool wasting his time on something completely pointless. This dangerous and meaningless obsession frightened her because all she could think about was losing the house along with her new television walls. She repeatedly begged her husband to stop and burn the books before anyone noticed, but by then there was no stopping him. The image of the old woman who had chosen to die with her library kept coming back to him. If the books had truly been empty and useless, she would have walked out of the house, but she hadn't. Even Beatty, the man who demanded that literature be destroyed, constantly quoted from books. And of course, how could he not think of Clarice, who never watched television and yet seemed more alive and happy than everyone else? Montag kept sorting through the books and trying to read them aloud, but the words felt unfamiliar and were sometimes impossible for him to understand. He asked his wife to stop for a moment and talk to him so they could at least try to make sense of their lives. He kept bringing up Clarice, the old woman who had died, and the endless wars. Military aircraft were flying over the city more and more often, and the noise had become so familiar that people barely noticed it anymore. And yet no one could even explain why the war had started or who they were fighting. No war ever makes ordinary people's lives better, so why fight at all? Was it only to defend someone else's interests and ideas that had been forced upon them? Television assured everyone that the conflict would end almost immediately and that their army was unbeatable. People eagerly believed those promises and never stopped to think about the death and destruction that would follow. To the people living there, war had become just another television show, something that seemed completely disconnected from their own lives. All this time, Montag sat there asking himself question after question. He tried to understand why the country was at war, why other nations hated them, and why people called themselves happy while killing one another on the roads and barely speaking to their own families. Of course, he had no answers, and that only made him more anxious. His wife spoke louder and louder before finally starting to scream because thoughts like these terrified her. Montag also understood that books were too difficult for him to figure out on his own and that he needed someone who could help. That was when he remembered an old man named Faber. A year earlier, Mentag had been walking through a park when he met the old man sitting on a bench with a small book in his hands. The moment Faber saw a fireman, he became frightened and immediately tried to hide the book. By law, Mentag should have arrested him on the spot and burned the forbidden object, but that day he did neither. Faber turned out to be a former English professor who had lost his job when books were no longer considered useful. The two quickly got to know each other and spoke for a long time. Before they parted, Faber even read him a few lines from the book and gave him his phone number. Perhaps he hoped that sooner or later Mentag would realize that something was deeply wrong with the world. And now that moment had finally arrived. Mentag called the old man and carefully asked how many copies of the Bible, Shakespeare's works, and other famous books were still left in the world. Faber immediately became terrified and assumed it was some kind of test that would end with his arrest. He insisted that he had no books and had no idea what Mentag was talking about, then immediately hung up. Mentag then took one of the books he had stolen, a copy of the Bible, and went straight to Faber's house. On the way, he rode the subway and tried to read, even though it was extremely difficult for him. He remembered something from his childhood when a relative at the beach had once challenged him to fill a sieve with sand. If the boy succeeded, he would receive a coin, but of course, it was impossible. The faster he worked, the faster he lost everything he had managed to collect. And now the same thing was happening with the book. The faster he tried to read, the harder it became to hold on to the meaning. His mind felt like a sieve with sand pouring straight through it. The loud advertisement being repeated over and over inside the subway car only made things worse. In those conditions, concentrating was almost impossible. Mentag made the mistake of reading aloud, which immediately upset the other passengers. No one wanted to hear those difficult words, so people began shouting at him. He had to rush out of the train and continue on foot so he wouldn't attract even more attention. When he finally reached the house, Faber refused to open the door for quite some time because he was afraid it was a trap. His attitude changed only after Mentag showed him the Bible. For someone from Faber's generation, the Bible was almost a miracle. It might even have been the last surviving copy, which left the old man with little choice but to open the door. Mentag quickly explained everything and said he wanted to understand why his life felt so empty. They seemed to have everything, and everyone claimed to be happy, but deep down, they were all miserable. Something was clearly missing, and perhaps that missing thing was books. Faber replied that it wasn't only about the books themselves because they were still just objects made of paper and ink. The real value of a book was that it could describe life honestly. Put simply, books were only one kind of container where people stored the things they were afraid to forget. According to the old man, people needed three things, and the first was meaningful, high-quality information. Instead of beautiful and comforting words, people needed the details of real life, including its most unpleasant, difficult, and contradictory sides. A good book never presents the world as smooth and safe. It shows the world as it truly is. A person can see their own mistakes, examine their failures, and admit their weaknesses. Second, people need free time to think about all that complicated information. In modern society, people seem to have plenty of time, but in reality, every minute is filled with television, music, or meaningless entertainment. A person can spend an entire day doing nothing and still never spend a single minute alone with their thoughts. Third, people must have the freedom to act on the conclusions they reach. There is no point in reading and thinking if afterward you make no attempt to change yourself or society. Television had taken away all three of the things Faber described. The giant screens created the illusion of closeness and communication while actually doing nothing but overwhelming people. Instead of inviting the viewer to think or disagree, television immediately delivered a ready-made conclusion, leaving no time to question it. Faber was clearly speaking about something that had troubled him deeply for a very long time. He seemed to hate the televisions that stood directly in front of people and told them what to think, what to fear, whom to love, and what to buy. Because lies were repeated so quickly and so often, people eventually stopped being able to tell truth from fiction. After hearing all of this, Montag immediately suggested fighting back against the system. He said he was ready to start printing books and distributing them among the people in order to restore the knowledge that had been lost. The old man immediately called the plan insane. Faber was a cautious man who had spent many years living in fear. All that time, he had never even tried to do anything to protect the knowledge that was disappearing. Perhaps he was now ashamed of his own cowardice, but he was still afraid to openly challenge the government and the system. To force him to reconsider, Montag had to become extremely aggressive. He began tearing pages out of the Bible and said he would only stop if Faber agreed to help him. A man who considered the Bible sacred couldn't bear to watch, and before long, he gave in. He decided to contact a former printer who still knew how to use old equipment and might be able to produce several copies of the books. That might have seemed like enough, but Montag didn't want to stop there. He suggested planting books in the homes of firemen and then reporting them to the authorities. Those men would be punished, lose their homes, and spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Once people began to suspect the firemen, chaos would spread through the system itself, but Faber wasn't convinced the plan would work. The only thing that might truly change the situation was the approaching war everyone kept talking about. If the city's communication systems were destroyed, people might finally get a chance to rebuild society from the ground up. All they had to do was preserve a small number of books, and that might be enough to open people's eyes to the truth. Faber then showed Montag a tiny device that looked like a radio receiver. A person could place it in their ear and speak to someone over a great distance. The device would allow Faber to guide Montag and stop him from doing something reckless. In fact, the old man had designed these devices a long time ago, but until now, he had been too afraid to use them. Only now did he finally have a friend he could trust and a cause worth taking a risk for. Before leaving, Montag even gave him money so Faber could contact the old printer and begin preparing for the work ahead. Montag then returned home, where his wife was already sitting with two of her friends. The women had come over to drink and watch another program on the giant screens. Nothing unusual. They spoke loudly, constantly interrupted one another, and laughed after almost every sentence as though they had the minds of children. At first glance, the conversation seemed lively, but in reality, no one was truly listening to anyone else. Montag watched them for a while out of curiosity, then suddenly switched off all the television walls. Left sitting in a silent room without those voices around them, the women immediately became uncomfortable and had no idea what to do next. The firemen decided to ask where their husbands were. The women calmly explained that their husbands had been drafted into the army and that, according to the government, the war would last only 48 hours before everyone came home. They spoke without the slightest fear because, in their minds, it was always someone else's husband who got killed, so there was nothing to worry about. They claimed they didn't know a single person who had died in a war, or perhaps they were simply afraid to remember anyone who had. Montag decided to use the moment to ask about their families. It turned out that each of the women saw her children as nothing more than an unpleasant responsibility. They tried to spend as little time with them as possible and even sent them to school on weekends. One of the women admitted that she had only had children because that was what people were expected to do, and now she suffered because of it. With every word they said, Montag became angrier and angrier. He understood perfectly well that the supposedly happy people sitting in front of him didn't truly love their husbands or care about their own children. The women only became interested when he asked how they had chosen the president. According to them, they had voted for the candidate who was handsome, tall, and extremely confident, while his opponent looked dull and unpleasant. Of course, none of them knew anything about their political platforms because no one had ever discussed them. Faber kept trying to calm Montag through the device in his ear, but none of it helped. The firemen finally lost control and pulled out a book of poetry. Mildred immediately became nervous and tried to pretend it was just some harmless game so no one would suspect anything. She explained to her friends that firemen sometimes brought books home to show their families just how terrible and harmful they were. Montague ignored her, opened the collection, and read one of the poems aloud. The poems spoke about anxiety, loneliness, and a world that looked beautiful on the surface but was actually filled with suffering and pain. The women weren't used to words that made them feel anything real, which was why one of them immediately began to cry. None of them could even explain what they were feeling, as though their hearts were speaking for them. In the end, the women quickly left, and Mildred accused her husband of ruining her friendships and humiliating her in front of everyone. To be honest, Montague himself realized that he had made a mistake. He had only wanted to wake these people from their endless sleep, but instead, he had only frightened them. Faber was unhappy as well and kept repeating that you couldn't force someone to think. A few minutes later, Mildred began burning some of the books until Montague stopped her. He hid the remaining books in the yard and went to work, where Mr. Beatty was already waiting for him. The chief greeted Montague very calmly, as though nothing had happened between them. He asked Montague to hand over the book and immediately threw it into a trash can. Then he started quoting books again and arguing that they were useless and existed only to confuse people. He was trying to prove that any idea could be challenged by another one. And if books constantly contradicted one another, then it was easier to get rid of them entirely. It was difficult to follow what he was saying because the chief was deliberately confusing Montague, making him doubt himself and pushing him toward a confession. Fortunately, Montague could hear Faber's voice in his ear, constantly trying to calm him and warning him not to take the bait. The mechanical hound was lying nearby as well, once again acting restless, as though it already knew a criminal was standing in front of it. The tension had reached its limit, and it felt as though a single spark could set everything off. At that exact moment, the alarm sounded. The firemen quickly put on their uniforms, climbed into the engine, and raced through the dark streets of the cold city. Montague rode with them, trying to figure out where they were going. Then the engine turned onto a familiar street and stopped in front of a familiar house. Montague saw his own yard, then his own home, with his wife standing outside beside a suitcase. She hurried past him without even looking him in the eyes. A taxi pulled up almost immediately, and she drove away without saying where she was going. Of course, she was the one who had reported the books. Or perhaps it had been her friends, who had become so upset over a simple poem. Beatty immediately understood everything, slowly turned toward Montague, and ordered him out of the engine so that this time, instead of burning someone else's house, he could burn his own. That very morning, the house had still felt familiar and safe. It held Mildred's television walls, their bedroom, the furniture, and everything they had collected over the years of their marriage. But now the building felt completely foreign to him, just like his wife, who couldn't even bring herself to look at him. Montague tried to stop her, but she only muttered something about her relatives, meaning the people from the television shows. I think everyone has already guessed that she wasn't worried about her broken marriage or her husband's arrest. She was worried about losing her expensive televisions. She left and never saw Montague again. The chief then approached him and calmly explained that several people had reported him, his wife and her friends. Perhaps Mildred hoped that by doing this, she could avoid punishment and start a new life somewhere else. In a way, you can understand her because she had simply chosen the familiar world of television, which felt much closer to her than her own husband did. Beatty then handed Montague the flamethrower and ordered him to burn down his own house. Clearly, the chief wanted to do more than simply destroy the books. More than anything, he wanted to humiliate Montague and force him to destroy with his own hands everything that connected him to his former life. The other firemen had been soaking the rooms in kerosene, but Beatty stopped them and said the criminal had to do the dirty work himself. Montague entered his own home and first aimed the flames at the bedroom, then calmly burned the furniture and those hated television walls. I don't think it's strange that this was the exact moment when he felt a sense of relief. Along with the house, his old life burned away, a life filled with empty conversations, his wife's silence, and an inner emptiness that could never be filled. Fire once again gave him a sense of power, but this time the feeling was completely different. In the past, he had happily burned other people's homes without ever thinking about the people who lived inside them. Now the flames had destroyed his own possessions, and he finally understood what the victims of the firemen had felt. While Montag worked, Beatty openly told him that the moment the house finished burning, he would be arrested. Even then, Montag still hoped he might somehow escape and make it to Faber. Eventually, the chief noticed that Montag kept responding with a delay, almost as though he were listening to someone else's voice. Beatty struck Montag in the head, and the radio transmitter fell from his ear onto the ground. The chief picked up the device, heard the old man's voice, and realized that the criminal had an accomplice. Beatty was pleased because now he had more work to do and a chance to earn a bonus for capturing an organized group of book lovers. Montag wasn't afraid of his own punishment, but he couldn't allow other people to suffer because of him. He could see that the chief was continuing to provoke him and deliberately trying to push him over the edge. And that was exactly what happened when Montag felt rage completely take over. He raised the flamethrower, pulled the trigger, and aimed the flames at Beatty. Within seconds, the man who represented the entire system had become a charred corpse. Before we continue, I should point out that the chief didn't even try to run away. That memory stayed deeply lodged in Montag's mind, and he would think about it many times afterward. He even began to wonder whether Beatty had actually wanted to die. After all, he knew far too much, hated the system deep down, and despised himself for the work he did. At that moment, none of this mattered because the other two firemen immediately rushed at him. Montag struck them and knocked them to the ground, but he didn't try to kill them because they were just ordinary men who had never learned how to think for themselves. At that very second, the fearless mechanical hound leapt out of the engine. It instantly identified its target and charged in for the kill. We should not forget that a long needle filled with deadly poison extended from its snout. A single touch was enough to end a person's life on the spot. The mechanical hound first grabbed Montag by the leg and began pulling him closer so it could inject the poison more easily. A moment later, the needle pierced his leg and injected a small amount of poison. Montag felt a sharp burst of pain, and then his leg went numb. One more second and the entire story would have ended right there. But our hero managed to turn the flamethrower around and aim the flames at the hound. Its metal body caught fire, jerked several times, and then went completely still. Montag was left alone beside the burning house while the other firemen remained unconscious. The shouting and noise gradually began attracting attention, and he realized he could no longer stay there. Montag tried to run, but his injured leg barely responded, and he kept falling. Instead of heading straight for Faber's house, the first thing he did was run to dig up the books hidden in the yard. Of course, this was foolish, but without that kind of foolishness, the story would have been far too simple. The fireman reached the hiding place and found several books that had survived the fire. He hid them beneath his clothes and ran away without looking back at anything he had left behind. From that moment on, Montag was officially both a criminal and a murderer, so there was no longer any point in thinking about his former life. He moved through the dark streets, staying out of the light and constantly fighting the unbearable pain in his leg. Over the loudspeakers, residents were told to lock their doors, barricade themselves inside, and report anyone suspicious wandering the streets. Police helicopters were even sent into the sky, which meant the situation was truly serious. The show had begun on every television channel. That always happened whenever the system was hunting a criminal and wanted to prove that no one could escape justice. Montag's photograph appeared in every home, and he felt as though the entire world was watching him. All he wanted was to reach Faber's house as quickly as possible, although his chances were slim, to put it mildly. On the way, he stopped at a gas station where almost no one was around. From a television, he heard that the war had begun, but no one seemed to care. Montag went into the restroom, washed his face, and tried to pull himself together. He needed to wash the blood from his face and somehow get rid of the kerosene smell clinging to his clothes. The moment he stepped outside, he heard the whine of an approaching car. It was a group of those teenagers who loved driving around at night for fun. They didn't slow down in time and clipped Montag, knocking him onto the pavement. Most of the time, something like that would have killed him, but this time the fall actually saved his life. A police car passed directly behind them, and because Montag was lying on the ground, no one noticed him. He got back up and thought about Clarice. Perhaps those same teenagers had run her down, meaning her death had not been some government conspiracy at all, but simply another cruel game played by children. Then he pushed the thought aside and hurried toward his friend's house. On the way, he passed the home of another fireman and suddenly had an idea. Montag slipped into the yard from the back and hid one of the books near the entrance. Then he went to a phone booth and called the fire department to report that forbidden literature was being kept in Mr. Black's house. In this way, he tried to carry out at least part of his old plan, knowing that the firemen would now come and burn down the home of one of their own. At that moment, he said something chilling: "For all the houses you burned, now yours will burn too." After that, Montag continued on and finally reached Faber, who had already seen the news. The old man couldn't believe Montag had somehow made it to his house when practically everyone in the city was looking for him. Montag then explained everything that had happened, which frightened Faber even more. The old man quickly realized that the police would soon trace their connection and find both of them. They had to wipe down the doorknobs, furniture, and everything else Montag had touched with alcohol. The towel had to be burned, the ventilation turned on, and mothballs scattered around the house so that no scent remained. That was because the mechanical hound tracked people by smell and almost never made mistakes. The old man then gave Montag some old clothes, a suitcase, and a pair of his own shoes. Faber's scent was supposed to cover the smell of kerosene and blood on Montag. Faber himself planned to leave early the next morning on a bus to St. Louis. An old printer he knew lived there and might agree to help them produce copies of the books. As for Montag, Faber explained how he could escape the city. He needed to reach the river, get into the water, and let the current carry him downstream. Beyond the river, there should be an abandoned railroad line, and if he followed the tracks, he might find people hiding from the authorities. These were not criminals, drifters, or homeless people, but mostly former professors, scientists, writers, and priests. They had not formed an actual army and were not trying to attack the system. Their main purpose was simply to preserve the knowledge contained in books. Montag thanked Faber and left the house. The old man had done everything he could, and for the first time in his life, he felt his fear begin to fade because he had finally done something meaningful, something he could be proud of. The televised manhunt continued, and by that point, the authorities had already released another mechanical hound to track him down. The announcer told viewers that a special operation was about to begin and instructed everyone in the neighborhood to open their doors and look outside at the same time to help find the fugitive. Montag kept running between the houses, counting the seconds so that when everyone looked outside, he could hide in the bushes or among the flowers. The tension was unbearable, and there were several moments when he was almost spotted. Even without anyone seeing him, however, the mechanical hound had already picked up his trail. It began closing in on Montag and nearly caught him by the shoulder, but the fireman reached the river just in time and jumped in. After the chaos and constant noise of the city, the water felt almost heavenly. There were no advertisements, stupid voices, sirens, or cars. The mechanical hound was left behind for one simple reason: it couldn't swim. In the river, Montag was able to take off his clothes, wash himself thoroughly, and change into Faber's old things. After that, he finally relaxed and let the current carry him toward a new life. For the first time in a very long time, he stopped running and simply let himself rest. Floating on his back, Montag looked up at the sky and saw real stars, something he had never truly noticed before. He remembered Clarice, who had always noticed the hidden beauty in the world around her. That was when he understood that he was leaving behind not only the city, but his entire former world. After some time, the current carried him onto the shore, and he found himself in a forest. At first, the silence frightened him more than the noise of the police, and every snapping branch seemed more terrifying than the mechanical hound. A large animal emerged from the darkness, and Mintag thought the hound had somehow caught up with him. He was already preparing to run when he realized it was only an ordinary deer. The animal calmly looked at him and then disappeared among the trees. The city had distorted his perception so badly that even a harmless deer now filled him with fear and panic. The forest smelled of earth and grass, scents that somehow reminded him of Clarice. Now he had to find the abandoned railroad line, and that took several hours. The tracks had not been used for a long time because trains no longer ran there, and the wooden ties had almost disappeared beneath the plants. Mintag followed the rails without knowing whether he would truly find the people Faber had described or whether they were only stories invented by an eccentric old man. Perhaps there was nothing ahead but an empty road, but he had no other choice and had to trust his instincts. After a long journey, Mintag finally saw a faint light in the distance. It was a campfire. He approached carefully, hid in the bushes, and noticed several men sitting beside the flames. The first thing he noticed was that this fire was completely different from the flames used by the firemen. It wasn't trying to destroy books or houses. Instead, it warmed the people, lit their faces, and helped them cook food. This was a fire that brought people together instead of destroying things. In other words, it was finally serving its natural purpose. The people beside it were speaking calmly and discussing something. They didn't interrupt one another or try to fill every second with meaningless noise. Each man spoke only when he genuinely had something to say, which seemed almost unnatural to someone who had grown up inside the system. Suddenly, they noticed Mintag and even called him by name. The reason was simple. They already knew who he was and where he had come from. Their leader was a man named Granger, who immediately offered Mintag coffee and gave him clothes to keep warm. Then they gave him a colorless liquid to drink that would temporarily change the chemical scent of his body. That was supposed to protect him from the mechanical hound, which was still trying to pick up his trail. These men occasionally watched television so they could keep track of what was happening in the city. They showed Mintag that the police had already lost his trail but were unwilling to admit defeat. After all, millions of viewers were watching the chase, and the authorities needed to give them a victory. So the police chose a random man who happened to be walking down the street. The cameras avoided showing his face up close so no one could tell whom the mechanical hound was actually killing. Afterward, the announcer proudly declared that Guy Mintag had been destroyed. This perfectly showed that the government cared more about preserving the appearance of victory than catching the real criminal. The viewers got what they wanted and then returned to their ordinary lives. The people in the forest were not surprised because they understood exactly how the system worked. They introduced themselves and confirmed that their group really did include professors, writers, priests, and even historians. After books were outlawed, they left their cities and began new lives near abandoned railroad lines. They kept almost no physical books because even one discovered copy could expose the entire group. Instead, each person had to memorize one book completely. One man was Plato's Republic, while another carried the writings of Marcus Aurelius in his memory. They didn't call themselves great or consider themselves better than anyone else. They were simply keepers of the words, keepers of history, and keepers of memory. If one of them was dying, he would pass his book on to someone else beforehand. They did all of this so literature would never truly disappear and humanity would always have some hope left. They had no intention of immediately returning to the cities and forcing people to read because that was not how change worked. Society could not be transformed by force. Instead, they waited for people to realize on their own that the old way of life could no longer continue and that everything was heading toward disaster. Mintag became worried because he couldn't remember a single line from the Bible he had tried to read on the subway. They immediately reassured him and explained that human memory worked far better than most people realized. He only needed to exercise his mind a little, and eventually the words would come back. Before long, aircraft appeared above the forest, which meant the war everyone had been hearing about on television had finally begun. A flash was followed by a monstrous impact, and Mentag immediately fell to the ground. The air trembled and the trees bent as an enormous cloud rose above the horizon. The city had just been completely destroyed, and at that moment Mentag thought of his wife, Mildred. He imagined her sitting in a hotel room in front of a television. Perhaps in her final seconds, she saw her own reflection on the screen and understood for the first time just how alone she truly was. The city that had believed itself invincible disappeared within moments. Immediately afterward, Granger stood up and suggested they make breakfast. Of course, it seemed strange because hundreds of thousands of people had just died, and yet they were about to eat. Still, life had to continue. It was somewhat like the story of the phoenix, a bird that burns in the flames and then rises again from its own ashes. In some ways, people are very similar to that bird because they build civilizations again and again, destroy them, and then start over. Human beings are capable of remembering their mistakes, and because of that, they may eventually break the endless cycle of disaster. Granger remembered his grandfather, who always said that a person should leave something real behind. It didn't have to be a great book or an important discovery. A person could plant a tree, build a house, or simply help someone else. The important thing was that after your death, the world should be at least slightly different from the way it had been before. Perhaps that was the true problem with the system because the people in the city left nothing behind. They only consumed entertainment, bought things, and constantly rushed from one place to another without creating anything lasting. After breakfast, the group of readers continued deeper into the forest. Soon, other people living alone and hiding were supposed to join them so they could gradually pass on the books they had preserved and teach others how to think for themselves. Mentag walked with them and, for the first time, felt that his life had finally found some meaning. He smiled and no longer doubted that he was truly happy. At the beginning of the novel, he had been a fireman and part of the system. Now he had become someone determined to destroy it. Yes, he had lost his home, his wife, his job, and his old life, but for the first time, he had gained the ability to think for himself and choose what kind of person he wanted to become.